I also want to welcome you to the LGBTQA Ally Development and Advocacy Empowerment for Academic Advisors webinar. As Lee said, I'm the chair of the Commission for LGBTQA Advising and Advocacy, Mandy Metzger, and I'm from Carroll University in Waukesha, Wisconsin. I'm also pleased to introduce my fellow commission members and panelists today. First of all, Craig McGill. He is a steering committee member on our commission from the Florida International University. Christy Carlson is an advisor connection volunteer, and you'll hear more about that program soon, from Trent University in Peterborough, Canada. And Nathan Vickers is a steering committee member for our commission from the University of Texas, Austin. So with that, I want to start off with a question to you all to think about. What do our LGBTQ students need? So as we start thinking about what our students need in general and how to deviate that from the uniquenesses of our LGBT students, we want to start talking about the necessities. We need students to be supported. We need students to have someone that understands them and understands what their different pieces of identity and their uniquenesses mean to them, but also to our campus community. They need someone that will listen without judgment or bias and advocate for their needs. Lastly, these students need someone who they feel comfortable going to connect them with LGBTQ resources on campus or in the community, or just to lend an ear.
So on the other side of the desk, what do academic advisors need to meet the needs of these students? Advisors must possess a willingness to advocate for their needs to members of the campus community, as well as the willingness to advocate for training and education for themselves, other staff members and faculty. An open mind, open ears, and understanding will provide LGBTQ students with support that is vital to them. Finally, advisors must be willing to reflect upon their own biases, and we all have them, and to recognize the privilege that comes from their own sexual orientation and position of authority. Recognition of our biases and privileges may be challenging, but doing so allows us all to garner a deeper understanding of ourselves. Now, I'm sure we've all heard or seen this particular student population labeled with an alphabet soup of letters. So we wanted to break the letters down for you and sort of define each one. So starting with the L, lesbian refers to a homosexual woman. Gay refers to a homosexual person, usually used to describe men, but may be used to describe women as well. Bisexual is a person who is emotionally, physically, and or sexually attracted to more than one gender, and you'll also hear this called bi. Transgender is a term that actually has many definitions and is frequently used as sort of a more of an umbrella term to refer to all people who deviate from their assigned gender at birth or deviate from the binary gender system. Queer is also an umbrella identity term that encompasses lesbian, questioning people, gay men, bisexuals, non-labeling people, transgender folks, and anyone else who does not strictly identify as heterosexual. Asexual is someone who does not experience any sexual attraction. Heterosexual is a person who is emotionally, physically, and or sexually attracted and committed to the members or a gender or sex that is seen to be opposite or other than the one with which they identify or identified with, also called straight. Homosexual is a very clinical term that originated in the late 1800s, and some members of the LGBTQA community avoid this word because it contains the base word sex. So the terms lesbian, bi, and gay are generally preferred by many in the LGBT community, as those terms are typically less technical and are not based on the base word sex. Heteronormativity describes how we as a society view heterosexuality as the norm. So society may revolve around the assumption that boys only like girls and girls only like boys, that one's sex is the same as one's gender, and that a person can only belong to one category. These assumptions are not always true. And to expand on some of the ideas from our previous slide, here are a few more terms that relate to gender that we would like to share with you. First, cisgender is a person whose gender identity and expression matches the gender typically associated with their biological sex. So, for instance, a female who identifies as a woman. Gender identity is the sense of being male or being female. And for some people, their gender identity is in accord with their physical anatomy. Gender expression refers to the ways in which people externally communicate their gender identity to others through behavior, clothing, hairstyle, voice and emphasizing, de-emphasizing, or changing their body's characteristics.
All right. So you may have already, most of you, heard all of these terms on the screen. We just wanted to bring them up because it is something that affects the LGBT community, especially on college campuses. A phobia, in general, is a fear or hatred of something or someone. There are 3 types of phobias that affect the LGBTQ community in different ways. Biphobia is the fear or hatred of bisexual people. Transphobia is the fear or hatred of transgender people or gender nonconforming behavior. And homophobia are thoughts, feelings, or actions based on fear, dislike, judgment, or hatred of lesbians, gays, and bisexuals. Heterosexism is the bias that heterosexuality is superior to or more natural than homosexuality or bisexuality. Different ways we may not even think about that heterosexism is ingrained into our society are, for example, many families now decide to find out the sex of their baby before the baby's birth. This then leads to baby showers that are either pink if they're having a girl or blue if they're having a boy, or people giving gifts that are either pink or blue instead of gender-neutral colors, or not thinking about a color before thinking about the gender of the child. Many companies' advertisements or commercials feature only heterosexual couples or parents. Only times when a company is targeting a specific community do you see gay or lesbian couples in their ads. There have been a few exceptions to this in the past years, and plenty of negative consumer feedback when it has happened. Something that we have to think about as advisors is not assuming a student has parents of different sexes or gender, or assuming a student is or could be in a relationship with an individual of the opposite sex or gender, such as asking a student if their mom or dad, or mom and dad, has looked over the information from orientation, or asking a young lady that steps into your office if she has a boyfriend when she starts talking about a date she had the night before. Heterosexism and homophobia are systematic and in our society every day, and they can hurt many people, not only those that are LGBT or Q, but also those who are in the closet. Many of our students come to a college campus not being out or still trying to figure out who they are or how they identify or how they want to identify. For these students, they feel like they have to lie and pretend with their roommates, new friends, faculty, staff, and their families back home. We really need to make sure that we're giving them a safe place to come and that they feel comfortable telling us about anything they're going through. For those who are coming out, especially at a college campus, we have many students in the coming out process, and they're feeling that they're fearing rejection from those new friends or from family back home. Roommates are a big issue. Sometimes when students are in a class that may talk about LGBT issues, they may feel scared to, say their opinion or give the academic advisor that they see a reason for not wanting to be in that class anymore. And really, it's because of a fear of coming out or what people would think. So we need to be aware of where there are safe spaces on campus and how we make those spaces safe for these students struggling in this long process of coming out. And for those who are already out of the closet, I can say for myself and some of my colleagues, we deal with put-down slurs, homophobic jokes, and we're talked about or stared at on most days. And for students, that is the case. They also get asked by faculty to be the voice of the community, and that's not fair to them either. So they may also encounter verbal or physical abuse, violence against them by total strangers or somebody they may know. So just a few things to think about. Definitely not all of the ways that this affects our students.
I mentioned before that advisors would need to know their own privilege and be willing to reflect on that privilege and what that privilege may afford them. So heterosexuals possess what we'll call heterosexual privilege, which is defined as the basic civil rights and social privileges that a heterosexual individual automatically receives, but are systematically denied to gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender persons on the sole basis of their sexual orientation. The fact that same-sex marriage is only legal or recognized in a handful of states is an example of heterosexual privilege. Beyond marriage, heterosexual couples rarely fear violence or ridicule by showing affection in public. In addition, heterosexuals are generally able to express pain over a relationship ending and receive empathy from others, and freely take part in discussions of attraction and crushes. It is still possible in some states for a member of the LGBTQ community to be fired for their sexual orientation.
So this is a quotation that I like to start at the beginning of many of my presentations of this sort because I really like what it has to say. People from privileged groups are routinely denied information and opportunities to understand their roles in an unjust social system, as well as honest feedback from people in oppressed groups. And the reason I really like this quotation is because it takes away the blame and allows us to focus on the real root of the problem, which is the lack of information for all of us who live in an oppressive culture. So over the last 15 to 20 years, a number of allied development models have been developed. We won't be going through all of these today, but I wanted to give you a sense of what has been done. The two we will be looking at are the Jackson and Hardiman model from 1982, and they developed a model of social identity development, which was not initially focused on LGBTQ allyhood development, but rather those who were in a dominant identity. And then we're also going to be looking at the Natsuki and Kjellberg model. And they were the first who proposed ally development in helping professions. In 1982, Jackson and Hardiman developed a social identity development model, which was the first to describe those in a dominant group. It was based on models of learning and unlearning oppression and racial and gender identity development. And it draws upon work from sociology, psychology, and anthropology. It's based on the assumption that oppression is a learned phenomenon. They've got 5 stages, and my discussion of their work is going to be developed based on an analysis by Barreto, who described an LGBTQ ally development model through their lens. The first stage is naive, and it lasts from birth to about 4 years old. Differences are noted in people, but not really in terms of a good-bad duality. Love and affection for the other gender is learned to be normal, And movement to the next stage happens as children are taught dominant views that some groups are better than others, what is normal, and that negative consequences are the result of not abiding by those dominant views. In the acceptance stage, a person accepts the dominant worldview. Sources of information are family, religious organizations, and educational institutions. The media defines scripts for gender and sexuality, and negative stereotypes perpetuate those scripts. The acceptance stage takes two forms. A person in the passive form unconsciously identifies with the dominant group. The person denies that oppression exists for target group members and blames them for any oppression that they might experience. A person in the active form consciously identifies with the dominant group because it gives them privilege. A person believes stereotypes that they have been taught about the oppressed groups. Many people spend their entire lives in this state. Movement to the next stage of resistance only happens if a person experiences discordance. The resistance stage also takes two forms. People enter this stage as they start to become aware of how forms of oppression operate in their lives. And so a person's role in the dominant group becomes more explicit. They learn that not all LGBT people fit into the stereotypes that they have been taught. And as such, they may begin to feel guilt, shame, and anger. They realize how homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia hurts LGBT people, and how they themselves benefit from heterosexism and being cisgender. To deal with this, people may start to learn more about LGBT culture. In the passive form, people may feel overwhelmed and incapable about doing much. They might challenge oppression, but probably only in situations in which they feel safe to do so. In the active form, people deliberately confront oppression, and they disassociate themselves with the dominant group. Their inability to accomplish their goals of ending oppression is what moves them to the next stage. The fourth stage is redefinition. And so while re-examining their identity, people on this stage consider ways to think about and act as members of the dominant group without being an oppressor. As part of understanding their role, they seek to find others who feel the same, who are also struggling to come to terms with their dominant identity. People in this stage begin to see how other types of oppression are related, like sexism, racism, classism, and genderism. A person has reconsidered their identity during redefinition, and so it becomes more stabilized in the internalization stage, and there's a less conscious effort to integrate this into one's being. There's a realization that one's dominant identity is related to all aspects of their life, and people actively work toward ending oppression. Jackson and Hardiman said that this is more of a hypothetical stage, as few people in this culture could ever achieve it. This is the Natsuki and Kjellberg model, and it's similar to the Jackson and Hardiman model, but it describes LGBTQ allyhood specifically in the context of helping professions. It's built on the seminal work of gay identity done by Van Cass in 1979, and so it consists of 6 comparable stages of confusion, comparison, tolerance, acceptance, pride, and integration. Because it's similar to the Jackson and Hardiman model, I'm not going to be discussing it in detail today. And so there are a few main criticisms that we see from these stage models. Like all stage models, there is an implication that the identity is achieved instead of something that is ongoing and reconstructed. And second, these models are merely a hypothetical description of how somebody might develop and go through various stages, but they have received no validation through empirical research. The last thing that I'm going to be describing to you today is the cycle of socialization, and it's based on work by Bobby Harrow in 1996. And so human beings differ from each other in many different ways. Just a few categories are gender, ethnicity, skin color, language, age, ability status, religion, and sexual orientation. If we could just appreciate each other's differences, we wouldn't be having this conversation today, but we just don't live in that world. So instead, each of us is born into a specific set of social identities related to the above categories, which predispose us to unequal roles in a dynamic system of oppression. The socialization process is pervasive, coming from all sides and sources. It's consistent, patterned, and predictable. It's circular, self-supporting, it's self-perpetuating, and it's often invisible, unconscious, and unnamed. Socialization begins before we are born. We have no choice about what we come into, and identities are simply ascribed to us at birth through no effort, decision, or choice of our own. We have no consciousness about who we are. We just are who we are. We are born into a world of pre-existing assumptions, rules, roles, and structures. Haro says, there is no reason for any of us to feel guilty or responsible for the world into which we are born. We are innocents, falling into an already established system. These characteristics were built long before we existed based on history, tradition, patterns of belief, prejudices, stereotypes, and myths. There are two groups. Dominant groups are agent groups. They are considered to be the norm. Assumptions are built around them. They receive recognition and reward, and they have the social power to name others. They are privileged at birth and have access to options and opportunities without realizing it. Agent groups include men, white people, middle and upper class people, abled people, heterosexuals, and Gentiles. For subordinate or target groups, little or nothing is known because they are not considered important enough to study. Some are virtually invisible, and others are defined by misinformation or very little information. They are disenfranchised, exploited, and victimized. Target group members include women, racially oppressed groups, LGBT of course, disabled, Jews, elders, youth, and poverty-stricken. When we are born, we are socialized by the people we love and that we trust, the people who raise us. They shape our self-concepts and our self-perceptions, the norms and rules that we follow, the roles we are taught to play, and our expectations for the future. Socialization happens both intrapersonally, how we come to think about ourselves, and interpersonally, how we relate to others. Examples might include boys don't cry, Christianity is the true religion, boys like girls, or don't be a sissy. Because these seem like truths, we may not think to even question them. We are dependent on those who raise us, and we haven't developed the ability to think for ourselves. Now, those who raise us are not to be blamed. They're doing the best that they can to raise us, and they only have their own frame of reference from which to draw. They may not have been taught to think critically about what to believe, and so they are unconsciously passing down what they have learned. So we're going to be doing a little learning activity, and I want you to choose one of your social identities from that list that I went through before. You know, it could be your gender, your skin color, your age, your religion, or your sexual orientation. I want you to think about what you have learned to be a person from that category. And as we continue to go through the cycle of socialization, I want you to continue to think about that and what you have been taught to learn to be that kind of a person. When we leave our home, we experience socialization in society, at church, school, the medical facilities, or grocery stores. And so Haro says, our socialization sources are rapidly multiplied based on how many institutions with which we have contact. You know, this is where we learn most of the messages about who to look up to or down upon, what rules to follow, roles to play, assumptions to make, what to think and what to believe. These messages will likely either reinforce or debunk what we have learned at home. Members of groups who benefit from these rules may not even notice that they are unfair, and members who do not benefit from these things may constantly feel uncomfortable. Haro says, we learn that these rules, roles, and assumptions are part of a structure that is larger than just our families. We get consistent similar messages from religion, the family doctor, the social worker, the local store, or the police officer, and so it is hard not to believe that what we are learning is true. These messages are woven into every structural thread of our culture: the media, our language patterns, the lyrics to songs, our cultural practices and holidays, and the very assumptions upon which our society is built. And so these all contribute to the reinforcement of the biased messages and stereotypes that we receive. And so then we come to the enforcements. People who conform, either consciously or unconsciously, to the status quo are left alone. They are considered to be normal, a team player, and stay comfortably in their social location with all its benefits. They receive privilege and rewards in maintaining the status quo, and they have access to other opportunities and receive attention and recognition for having made it. People who contradict the norms pay a price. They are seen as stirring the waves, as making trouble, or the cause of the problem. If members are of the target group, they are held up as examples as to why this group is inferior. If these people are from the agent group, they can also too be punished for breaking the rules. If you think about men who go against the norms for traditional masculinity, you might think about the stay-at-home dad who is seen as being lazy or unable to sufficiently provide for his family. Or heterosexuals who stand up for gay rights might be seen as being closeted gays themselves. And so the point that Haro is driving here is that systematic oppression is bad for all of us. Target identities experience anger, feeling silenced, a discordance between what society says that they'll stand for and what they actually feel. This leads to low self-esteem or stress, hopelessness, and disempowerment, which can then lead to crime, self-destructive behavior, and dehumanization. By giving in to systematic oppression, we perpetuate the system. So this learned helplessness or internalized oppression, or you might have heard of internalized homophobia in this case, this is all the notion of hating yourself for not being what society says that you should be. And this also impacts agent identities, who might experience guilt from unearned privileges or for their own oppressive actions. They might fear payback or experience stress and ignorance or have a distorted reality of how the world really is and obliviousness to the damage that we do. By continuing our roles as agents, remaining unconscious or unwilling to interrupt the cycle, we perpetuate the system. Haro says, to the extent that we fail to interrupt the cycle, we keep the assumptions, the problems, and the oppression alive. Once we become aware of oppression, we can't go back to not knowing about it. So what do? The easiest thing to do is to do nothing and to allow the status quo to continue, to choose not to make waves. After all, we might feel that it's too daunting to try and challenge a system so big. We might think, what can I do to challenge a system that has been in place for hundreds of years? And it might be frightening to challenge something so big. Additionally, if we are members of the agent group, we might see this as irrelevant. This has little to do with me. We might even not see ourselves as a homophobe or a racist, so we might think that there's no issue to really deal with. But Haro warns, it goes on, and unless we choose to interrupt it, it will continue to go on. Our silence is consent. She explains, we are blocked from action by the fear and insecurity that we have been taught. We have been kept ignorant and confused by myths and misinformation that we have been fed, and we lack a core of confidence and a vision to guide us. We don't know how to take action against a system so powerful and pervasive. As long as our core is filled with these negative elements, we will be paralyzed, and we will recreate the same cycle again. So, in order for change to happen, this cycle must be interrupted. Some members of target groups may try to interrupt the cycle due to discomfort, but doing so without organization may result in being kicked down to a powerless position. They need the work of agent allies. And so agent allies might decide to use their power and privilege to make change, either out of guilt, moral values, or vision. But Haro warns that if guilt is the motivation, it is unlikely to work. In order for real change to occur, We need to have a vision and work with others to build coalitions. She says, when groups begin to empower themselves by learning more about each other, by unlearning old myths and stereotypes, by challenging the status quo, we can make the difficult decision to interrupt the cycle of socialization. We begin to question the givens, the assumptions of society, the norms, the values, the rules, the roles, and even the structures. As we attempt to do this, it becomes obvious that we cannot do it alone. We must build coalitions with people who are like us and people who are different from us.
So I'm going to talk about a way of understanding LGBTQ allyhood that's in some ways similar to, but in other ways different from the notion of allyhood we find in the ally development models that Craig was talking about. I'm going to begin by talking about how identity has traditionally been conceptualized within social justice movements and how and why it's been reconceptualized through the concept of intersectionality. And then I'll discuss a queer theory-inspired approach to LGBTQ allyhood, which follows from this reconceptualized notion of identity. So traditionally, social justice movements have challenged discrimination against and fought for rights on behalf of particular identity-based groups, so groups of people who are said to share an identity, for example, women or lesbian and gay folks. But what we've seen over and over is that basing politics on identity categories leads to certain problems. So many of these problems stem from the practice of drawing boundaries to delineate who's on the inside and who's on the outside of the identity category. So in order for an identity category to come into existence, in order for some folks to be included in the category, others are excluded. So the category women is created by excluding those deemed not women or men. And this categorizing practice raises some questions. Where do the boundary lines get drawn? On what basis? Who makes these decisions? And what are the implications for these decisions for those on the inside, the outside, and the margins of these categories? Anyone who has felt that they aren't the right kind of lesbian or has been told that they aren't acting manly enough or they're not a real woman has encountered the enforcement of norms. Normalizing and legitimizing practices work to maintain the fragile coherence of identity categories by strengthening their boundaries. But in doing so, these practices homogenize those who are said to share an identity, race differences. In addition, these practices privilege those who best achieve norms, and they marginalize those who fail to achieve norms. So as Crenshaw explains, the erasure of differences within identity-based groups has privileged certain identities over others, leaving many on the outside of the inside, marginalized, feeling not at home in their identities. So take, for example, a queer women's group discussing oppression. They're coming from a cisgender perspective, but speaking as though this perspective represents the experience of all queer-identified women. This homogenizing practice renders invisible trans women's experiences and marginalizes trans women. So one of the key problems with identity-based politics is the tendency to overlook what Lord is talking about in this next quotation. Our political struggles are necessarily multifaceted because our identities are multifaceted. And as Sedgwick reminds us, even those who share most aspects of our identity may still be very different from us. And this brings me to the concept of intersectionality, which provides us with a way of thinking about identity that's different from how it has traditionally been thought about in identity-based movements. Viewed through an intersectional lens, identity is multiple and intersecting, and oppressive practices are interconnected. So heteronormativity interacts with racism, classism, cissexism, ableism, etc. We may have privilege along some axes of difference, for example, race, ability, gender identity, but not others, class, sexuality, for example. But it's important to also recognize that these multiple identities are not independent of each other, right? They overlay and define each other. So as a result, an Asian gay man doesn't encounter heteronormativity and racism separately. Moreover, not everyone who has privilege along a particular axis of difference shares the same experience of that privilege. For example, not everyone who identifies as heterosexual shares the same experience of heterosexual privilege. I'm thinking here of the heterosexual identified woman whose sexual practices may not always be read as normal because she's perceived as having too many partners. So queer theory-inspired social justice movements have found intersectionality to be a really helpful tool in challenging the categorizing practices that construct these stable, binary identity categories like heterosexuality, homosexuality. From a queer theory perspective, when we undermine the perceived coherence or unity, completeness of identity categories, and instead conceptualize identity as multiple, intersecting, fluid, and existing on a continuum, we open the door for new identities outside those binary categories to enter the room. So in addition to conceptualizing identity as multiple, fluid, intersecting, and existing on a continuum, queer theory views identity as something that we do, something that must be enacted, rather than something that we are, an identity we possess. So being queer identified doesn't automatically make me an ally to trans folks or even other queer identified cis women. I become an ally. I enact this identity through my ongoing behaviors. So from this perspective, allyhood is an identity that's always incomplete. It's not an achieved state, something realized by attending a workshop. Unlearning our socialization within a culture that perpetuates multiple intersecting forms of oppression is an ongoing process. So I'm continuously working to recognize my various privileges and also continuously confronted by the limitations of my understanding. As a result, I'm always in the process of becoming an ally. So in her book, Queer Theory, Gender Theory, Wilkins mentions that welcoming someone as an ally can sometimes send the message that this really isn't your issue, but you're welcome to help out. A queer theory-inspired perspective might send a different message. While we may be positioned differently, this is an issue for all of us. Right? Rather than developing ally practices based on homogenizing and exclusionary identity categories, we can develop ally practices that can be enacted by everyone and apply to anyone who needs them. And rather than understanding allyhood as something that folks outside of a particular group do to support and advocate for folks inside a particular group, allyhood can be understood as something everybody can enact. We can all be allies to each other by doing allyhood continuously across our differences. So queer allyhood then would entail a shared commitment to challenging, normalizing, privileging practices and oppression, not just on the basis of sexuality and gender identity, but also on the basis of race, ability, class, etc. So this is a social justice movement based on political commitments and alliances.
So, what does being and doing ally benefit you? Well, there are many benefits, and these are just a few. The ability to work with all students, no matter what their uniqueness or identity, and all colleagues. You start being on a different level and understanding each other at a different level. You broaden your personal relationships by doing that, and the congruence between your values and your actions become one. And people see that, which then perpetuates the cycle of the relationships being broadened. You may feel a stronger sense of self-efficacy. When you begin to intertwine your values and your actions, this also increases your self-esteem, and you really understand yourself better.
So breaking the cycle of socialization is really hard work. You probably thought about that as I was speaking. Because unlike any other area of allyhood, here there is an actual threat of being perceived as LGBT if you stick up for LGBT persons. And so the consequences may actually echo the experience of being LGBT. And that might be verbal abuse or ostracism. You might be seen as being too liberal or radical for sticking up for people. And for those of you who work at places where there might be a conservative culture, or you might have conservative board members at your institution, you might feel like your job is in jeopardy. So it's very hard work, and there are consequences of being an ally.
And like Craig's saying, it can require some work to be an ally and to do allyhood. And it is something that, while beneficial, may not come easily at first. So we've put together some strategies for you to kind of help you along the way. First, work with other allies to learn about ally development. And you can check out books in the library, or purchase a book from a bookstore, or look at information online to help you understand what it means to be an ally, or what it means to do allyhood. You can subscribe to magazines and to display that information and literature openly. Display it openly and let people know that you are learning these things, and show that people who come into your office that you're learning, and that you're trying to become an ally, or trying to learn how to become an ally or a stronger ally. Also, don't rely on LGBT persons to know everything about being an ally. Seek out information from allies, but educate yourself, and be an ally without expecting praise. And be patient. Be patient with yourself. It will take time. And allies will make mistakes. We all do. We all make mistakes. But don't let it stop you from doing the work you're doing and learning as much as you absolutely can.
So, key roles for allies fall roughly in these three areas, although they certainly overlap. Support. Allies can provide support and understanding to LGBTQ identified students and create open, supportive environments. We can find ways to show that our office is a safe space and encourage our advisees to define their own issues. Education. First step is to know ourselves, to recognize and challenge our own biases, fears, and privileges, as well as our own assumptions about gender and sexuality-based norms. It's also important to learn about and to keep updating and keep deepening our understanding of LGBTQ issues and culture, while remembering that people's identities are multiple and intersecting. In addition to scholarly books and articles, there are so many excellent websites, blogs, videos, TED Talks that all can help. We need to learn as well about resources, both on and off campus. And finally, advocacy. So some examples of ways that we can advocate for the needs of LGBTQ students include being visible. Let others know you're an ally. Share what you learn with other allies. Correct misinformation and challenge stereotypes. Use inclusive language. Challenge homophobic, biphobic, transphobic remarks. Advise LGBT groups. Attend events. Challenge inequity in policies and practices. And advocate for LGBTQ issues.
As we draw to the end of our presentation today, we wanted you all to walk away with some things to think about. So these scenarios are available in your handout as well. And let's take a moment to reflect on them. Reflect on how you have felt with each situation before today's presentation. How would you feel about them now that you've heard what we've had to share? And remember, there are no wrong answers at all. This is simply a chance for you to take a moment and reflect on how you would feel given these situations before the presentation, how you may feel during the stuff that we've shared with you today, and how you feel now.
All right. So then, what's next? Obviously, you're here to learn, and there's many ways to educate yourself by going to our commission website. If you take a look, we have a growing list of resources that our commission has been putting together and keeps on adding to. There's NACADA LGBTQA online resources. There's international and national online resources. There's online resources by NACADA region. So schools in those regions, different institutions, communities have actually asked me to put their information on our website for you all. Learn about the commission and ask questions. Take a look at our website again. We just spent a long time rewriting our vision, mission, objectives, and goals, and find out ways that you want to become involved. Take a look at our goals and our objectives and see if there's anything that you have a passion for. Let us know, and we'll get you set to go with one of our steering committee members. Our online web trainings are coming. They're brand new. We have steering committee members working on them as we speak. Things such as Alphabet Soup 101, getting started. So learning about those students, what identities there are out there, what those words mean. Alphabet Soup 102 is taking a little bit deeper look at the community and what effects our students are having on our institutions. There's an LGBT 101, 102, and also Safe Zone Training 101. So with that, that will be the basis of Safe Zone Training, the educational piece, the reading piece, and then we're hoping that many of you will be able to attend national or annual conferences or regional conferences and take part in the 102, where we actually discuss as groups what we've been learning and how to continue that learning to create those safe spaces on our campuses if our campus does not have a program like this that we can attend there. So there is a few minutes for questions. If you do have a question, there is a Q&A box in the middle of your screen. If you would like to type in a question, if you or your group that's viewing has any, we would be glad to take them. If we don't get to all of them today, as Lee said, we will have a print material that comes out to those of you that registered that you can pass on to everyone else viewing. All right, so I think the first question I'm going to go to is a little bit about words and labels. So Nathan, there were many words or labels that we didn't mention. Where can people viewing find more information or definitions so that they can get started?
I think online is a great resource. That's such an easy way for us to reach out and get online and see some things or information. If you felt comfortable doing so, you could also ask someone. I mean, you could sort of, if you hear a word that you don't recognize or hear someone label themselves with a word that you don't know, and if you felt comfortable doing so, you could always ask them and try to understand where they're coming from. And of course, there are always books that you can check out, but I think online is a great way to start and to start looking up some of these words that you may hear and may not necessarily know what they mean or.
Thanks, Nathan. There's a great question on queer theory. So Christy, what are some things allies can do in their advising practices that align with queer theory?
Yeah, a number of things that kind of come to mind would have to do with avoiding or challenging notions of identity or narratives of identity that our advisees might find limiting or marginalizing. So, for example, we can avoid making assumptions about their identities and avoid positioning them in ways that they might find limiting. Instead, we can allow them to tell us how they see themselves. We can avoid making generalizations about identity categories and not even assume that all of our advisees might identify with binary identity categories. We can, of course, remember that their identities intersect with other identities, and we can refuse to play that gatekeeper role of enforcing boundary lines between identity categories and be supportive of students or advisees who transgress those boundaries. So all of these things would hopefully allow our advisees to really bring all of themselves to the conversations that we're having with them. And the other main idea that I have would relate to making explicit and unpacking normative assumptions that our advisees might have. So when we're talking with them and they're struggling with pressures to claim a fixed identity, we can shift the conversation to the contexts that are producing these pressures. Where do these rules come from? What does their experience suggest about these rules? So if we put the focus on the normalizing practices, we can hopefully challenge ideas that our advisees may be measuring themselves against with regard to what's normal. So yeah, I think those are a few ideas that come to mind.
Great. All right. One more I think we have time for. Our office has gone through Safe Zone training, but we still feel we aren't doing enough. What else can we do? And I'm just kind of going to go between panelists here. I think we all have some ideas, but I'll give you a start. First of all, I want to commend you for being here. This is a great step to learning the next part of allyhood development. As we were saying the whole time, it's about doing acts of allyhood and not just our identities. some of the other things, as your office, moves towards giving that safe space to students, check out our website, check out those online training sessions that are coming out. They will be coming through the listserv. As soon as they're out there, I will be sending out updates. So check those out as a advising staff, as a group. Create discussion groups. Maybe read an article and come back together and see how you can put some things into practice. Remember, this not only will help your LGBT students, it will help all students with all uniquenesses. Anyone else? All right. So we have about 1 minute. Craig, you want to stick a little piece about your article in here?
Sure. If you haven't done so already, you should check out my article. It's listed on the pre-webinar listing. And it's really interesting because there is research and literature available in our field about what LGBT students need, and Nathan and Mandy talked a little bit about that. But our field doesn't really cover the things that advisors need. And so that was kind of the impetus for this webinar and the article itself. I got responses from 5 or 6 advisors about how they felt in terms of their own allyhood development, and that article just kind of sums up the responses that I got. And I think that there's a real need for even more investigation on this topic. But I thank you all for coming today. This is a wonderful start.
Wonderful. As Craig said, thank you for joining us. If you have any other questions, I'm sure that you can get a hold of us on our website. Every single person on the panel is listed with their contact information. So please, if you have any questions, send them to us. Otherwise, we'll see you later. I also want to welcome you to the LGBTQA Ally Development and Advocacy Empowerment for Academic Advisors webinar. As Lee said, I'm the chair of the Commission for LGBTQ